All right. So welcome to Nasli and Lauren to join us to talk from both SUNY system as well as from Purchase to share some information about our students with disabilities.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca, and everyone else for joining today. My name is Nasli Kirkjian. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the coordinator of disability and non-traditional student services and the SUNY system EIT accessibility officer within the Office of University Life, which is our student affairs office at SUNY System Administration.
And I'm Lauren Rodriguez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Office of Disability Resources at Purchase College, SUNY. And I've been here for about 7 years. My background is I'm also a school psychologist, and I do private practice. So outside of Purchase, I also complete neuro or psychological evaluations for individuals with disabilities. So that's a little bit about my lens on this presentation.
And since we're an intimate group today, I mean, we would have said this anyway if we were a huge group, but like we're so open to being flexible about the format of this. Like we can present to you the slides, we can have a dialogue. I think what would be best is to perhaps introduce some key concepts and then go into more of a question answer dialogue kind of format if you wish. Perhaps it would be helpful if you could put in the chat like what your I guess what your proximity, what your foundational understanding of accessibility or disabilities may be. Like one being I don't know a lot, and five being I'm a disability studies scholar. Let's just say, just so Lauren and I get a sense of who's in the room too. Okay, I'm a disability studies learner. Wonderful. We're all learning. Lauren and I don't pretend to know everything either. We are constantly learning.
Totally. I was like, this is exciting. We're always updating our presentations the more we learn.
All right, so I guess we'll just start at the beginning and go from there. What we hope that you gain from this presentation is like to understand the key concepts for disability in society at large and also in the context of higher education, know what kinds of students with disabilities we serve at SUNY, and recognize the ways to reduce or eliminate barriers to access in our attitudes, our environments, be it physical or virtual, ultimately with the goal of providing inclusive education. So I already said we're going to go over key concepts, so I'm going to skip this slide. As institutions of higher learning, we are obligated under several federal laws to prohibit discrimination against individuals with disabilities. And so the legal framework that we operate under is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Title II specifically covers public institutions, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And so a disability is legally a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And a major life activity for the purposes of this conversation is learning. But we also know that other major life activities can impact access to learning, like walking and speaking and hearing, how we interact with the environments that we are designing and delivering these days, right? A record of having such impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment is also part of the definition. I importantly want to stress that this is the floor. The ADA and Section 504 is the bare minimum compliance that we are obliged to provide. And so, you know, offices like Lauren's follow these laws as a baseline for decision making, but Purchase and Oswego, notably, in my opinion, go above and beyond to provide students like full, meaningful access.
So on this slide, it's really going over the theoretical framework that we work upon. So right now, society in general and many people view persons with disabilities in a medical sense. So a prevalent model of disability is that the impairment is often the focus, and there's stigma often attached. And we sometimes are really operating in this reactive model, right? Waiting for someone to come to our office to say I'm experiencing a barrier in this specific class or in housing or access to the meal plan, and then our office is providing some type of accommodation. And historically have looked at access as more of like a medical model, the law, kind of what Nasli was talking about. And where we're really trying to shift our focus to is the social model of disability. And that is more or less looking at there's an environment we have created that disables an individual that has some type of impairment. So really adapting more inclusive, identifying and removing barriers before individuals come to say they even exist, and providing accessible environments to everyone. And so, like as a simple example, if a person is unable to climb stairs, the medical model, this old type of thinking, would focus on making the individual physically able to climb the stairs, whereas the social model tries to make stair climbing unnecessary, such as by replacing stairs with a wheelchair accessible ramp or an elevator. And so I recently attended a presentation from Zebediah Hall at Cornell University, and I loved how he reframed the disability definition, and he's really pushing for explaining it as the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in society on an equal level with others due to social and environmental barriers.
I'll just add that, we're starting this out this way because, we may be more knowledgeable about some of the theory or practice and application of the accommodations framework, but faculty are so instrumental to supporting this cultural change and reframing the definition of disability. And so that's why we're focusing a bit more on ableism and the attitudes of each of us and encouraging self-reflection. And then we'll get into some more like actual things you can do in the classroom that will be more user-friendly for everyone, including individuals with disabilities. And to that point, on this slide is a graphic from Microsoft about inclusive design. And that, when we think about people with disabilities, a lot of us really think about physical disabilities or permanent disabilities that we can visually see. But there's so many individuals with invisible disabilities, and we'll share how significant that population is at SUNY and at large. There's people with temporary disabilities and persons in situational contexts as well that would benefit from inclusive design. From Lauren's example with the wheelchair accessible ramp, some of you may be parents or thinking about having children, and of course, having the strollers and or you're aging. We're all aging, and so we're all temporarily able-bodied, and one day that curb is going to be really hard to get and step on, right? And so all of these things are taking into considerations from birth to the latter points of life. And so we encourage you to think about accessibility as not just for disclosed students and employees, but thinking broader than the visible disabilities. And I saw this poster on LinkedIn, and it was like, think outside the chair, which I'm still not sure how I feel about language wise, but I thought it was a good way to, actually, think outside the box, think beyond the chair, and that the functions, we can be limited to them at any time due to these designs. And so, ableism is really so deeply ingrained within our culture, and it's often really unconscious, but it impacts our perceptions of competence, particularly in higher education, where we are exclusionary institutions by design. So ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. And so this can classify, able-bodied people and disabled people as less, as other and less than. And I've included some pictures on this slide of some common examples. I see this all over the internet, even within our own um, field, is this idea that people with disabilities need help, that they are like Dopey from Snow White and incompetent, because they need extra time on an exam. Like, I don't think that necessarily demonstrates the knowledge, right? It's just someone might benefit from having extra time to just demonstrate that knowledge, right? And then of course there's inspiration porn, is when people post photos or share articles about really inspirational athletes in wheelchairs or paraplegics who, if they can do it, so can you. And that's really, really harmful. So hopefully we're all more aware of the more obvious language ableist terms like insane or lame or dumb. And these really have been long historically used to categorize people with disabilities as deficient, inferior, and really undermines our collective work towards justice. And what does that look like, besides the language? On the left here is 2 pictures of what, pre-civil rights or even post-civil rights in some places in this country differentiated and segregated white people and people of color. And so this image on the top left here is a water fountain for white people, and on the right is for colored people. And this is appalling. Obviously, we have come a long way from this, and this is totally unacceptable. And so, that what we're trying to articulate here is that reality is still very much real for people with disabilities. Every time I go to a restaurant, I'm like, okay, so I can't go to the private dining space upstairs. There's no accessible menu. The website for this is horribly designed. I can't even find the information, and I'm not even visually impaired or have a cognitive disability that impacts my navigating of this information, and I'm still having a hard time finding this information. And so on the right here is like the very physical pictures of water fountains for differently sized people, or a sign next to a set of stairs that says disabled people, there's another entrance for you. So we have grandfathered in a lot of ableist tendencies and architectural standards and technical standards. And what we hope that you get from this today is that, wow, we really need to move away from that. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to handle what this looks like in higher ed.
Yeah, so I also wanted to give a shout out. We do a similar type presentation on my campus, and I work with Rebecca Oling a lot, who's our interim director of digital accessibility, and she's a librarian. And so when we're talking to our faculty, some of the things that we've seen on campus, faculty and staff of ableism includes some assumptions such as the disability office will handle those students or those types of needs. All students, thinking that all students formally come to our office to disclose their disability, and that also their disability is visible or obvious, because we know that many of them are not. When it comes to accessing text for a class or a book, thinking that because I can see the text on a PDF, everyone can see or read it or has access to it. And that's the photo on the right-hand side, the example. That's an example of a bad scan of a PDF, and how someone with a screen reader who's using text to speech to have it read out loud to them, how many errors would show up are the red boxes. And so what that would be like if you were in that class and trying to gain access to that text to be prepared. Also assuming that needs are static and fixed. So oftentimes, when we're talking to students, they might come to us and say, right now, I identify with this mental health diagnosis, and we have a conversation with them about the barriers they're experiencing, but also we make sure to really let them know that just because you're experiencing now doesn't mean that you won't go to a different class and new barriers might come up, or you might have an exacerbation of symptoms for whatever reason. And in this class, you couldn't predict that something would be a barrier, and that's okay. That's normal. And so we understand that needs are not fixed. Our way of organizing information works for everyone, and also like not incorporating accessibility into our course design. And then assuming kind of what I spoke about, assuming we know exactly in what way a course will be or become accessible before it really begins. Also, sometimes maybe assuming we know much better than the student does, or maybe the disability services office, what accommodations a student experiencing, say, anxiety might need. And I think it's interesting because when we were coming up with this presentation, we were trying to figure out, well, how do we, give recommendations to faculty when in reality, we know working with students, just because they come to our office and say, I have this diagnosis, it's not just like, oh, I have a learning disability. Okay, great. So these are all the things you'll need. That's not how it works. You meet one student on the autism spectrum. That means you met one student on the autism spectrum. And so when we're in the disability office working with students, we really, taking on the social justice model, we really listen to their self-report of the barriers that they've experienced in the past or are experiencing now to figure out access in their classes, maybe what accommodations they utilized in high school. And so just because someone has one type of diagnosis, we can't make, all the recommendations because it's so individualized and case by case. And then on the next slide, so some things that we've heard, along the way, and we know through research, when students experience barriers to self-disclosure, or they don't come to the office to request accommodations, really, sometimes they want a clean start, they'll say. So in high school, the system is very different. They had to leave the classroom to go to the resource room, and they just want to start fresh in college. They don't want to be identified by their peers as having disability, and they don't really understand how it works. Maybe wanting to be seen as quote unquote normal, perceiving it as a lack of independence when they're transitioning to the college setting, or that there will be some type of social threat or peer disapproval. The idea that faculty will not believe them, or this idea of thinking that they're being treated differently. And I also, like, one of the things I think I've learned along the way, which has always stuck with me, is remembering that as faculty and staff, there's this inherent power differential between students and especially faculty, because what we'll hear sometimes in our office is, students acknowledge that, well, if I request accommodations, the faculty might have to do more work. Understanding that the faculty member is the one that grades them. And so trying to, how do they navigate that? So I think it's really important to remember that power differential between students and faculty. And oftentimes, when we're working with students, we just re-explain, like, well, that's why our office exists. We get involved to provide consultation and figure out, what's fair to kind of remove the student from the power differential.
I'll just add, that what we're sharing on the slides, we can share the literature that we use to support this, but it's also very reflective of our, real experiences in the services for students with disabilities office. Mm-hmm. And so, the stigma, the discomfort, the interaction with faculty and its impact on the campus climate with students with disabilities is real. There are real differences between disclosed students with disabilities and non-disabled students through various research and surveys that, students with disabilities actually experience discrimination and offensive verbal comments. And it was actually found that these levels of discrimination and bias were second only to those reported by African-American students, and that the reported rates of all forms of discrimination and bias were the same or higher if the students had multiple identities, such as students with disabilities who identify also as Hispanic, African-American, multiracial, or another sexual orientation or gender identity. So I should also describe what's on this slide here is the percentage of students with or without disabilities who are comfortable in their classes, departments, and campuses. And on the left, you can see that there's students with disabilities, feel less comfortable in their classes, less comfortable in their academic department, and less comfortable on campus overall compared to their non-disabled peers. So that's why it's so important to design our courses, programs, activities, and whatnot, accessibly from the beginning. Not all the students will disclose. There's also, I should have probably added that there's also possibly cultural or financial barriers to getting, the kinds of documentation, that some campuses are pretty stringent on requiring. As Lauren said, many of our campuses are striving to, do the social model of disability, which encourages a individualized approach based on the student's self-report. And, documentation always helps with determining what would be the most beneficial, but it's really something that we don't want to require anymore. And I think COVID really helped push that across campuses, because a lot of the students coming in or transferring lost access or couldn't get information from their high schools and things like that. And so we had to be flexible and adapt. And so that's one of the silver linings, I think, from the pandemic. So anyways, UDL, Universal Design, is designing our environments and products to be usable to the greatest extent possible by all people without necessarily needing to retrofit. And it began as an architectural movement and is now incorporated into learning through multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement, which we won't dive deep into today, but some of the examples we provide later are reflective of the Universal for Design learning approach. And so this is what accessibility looks like physically, since it began architecturally from the inception of design. And so on the left here is Robeson Square in Vancouver. And it's a switchback ramps with a set of stairs. And on the right is the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley. Ed Roberts was a prominent civil rights activist in the disability movement. And that campus, that campus was designed completely accessibly from the start. It's if you ever want to Google or YouTube the Ed Roberts campus, it is the prime example of what a fully accessible physical space looks like. And so this image is a person in a wheelchair user coming to an elevator that has accessible paddle buttons at the bottom. So I'll give a brief overview of the students we serve at SUNY, and then perhaps we can open up to questions before we give some more practical suggestions here. The students we serve at SUNY, these are just the students that have disclosed with, offices like Lauren's. And so we have the most significant population we serve is the neurodevelopmental disabled students, so students with learning disabilities, ADHD, and students on the autism spectrum. The second highest category would be mental health disabilities at 23.8% here. And these could be, these are duplicate counts. So we do have many students with multiple disabilities. So they could be on the autism spectrum and have a psychiatric illness or something. And so, we have a range, but, a lot of this on this slide are invisible. So we don't always see, so it's important not to make assumptions about students. And then with the categories, I mentioned neurodevelopmental, as you can see on this chart, the trends at SUNY, well over 20,000 students each year disclose within those categories. And I'll just note that in 2016, that academic year, a lot of data was missing from campuses. So I'm pretty confident it was still over 20,000, but like 10 campuses didn't report data for some reason. And so this is how New York State Education Department asked campuses to report categories of students with disabilities. Like I said, neurodevelopmental covers LD, which is the highest, autism spectrum, which is always growing, and ADHD, sensory, which is the second highest, or I'm sorry, it's not the second highest, it's actually the lowest, but it covers the hard of hearing students, deaf, low vision, and blind students. Physical covers mobility and basic chronic medical conditions, and intersystem covers traumatic brain injuries, complex chronic medical conditions, and substance abuse recovery. We've seen a tremendous spike across all sectors across SUNY with mental health. I'm sure that's no surprise to you. All the Board of Trustees talks about lately is mental health, and especially now with COVID, it's really increased. So we know that like a lot of these students don't disclose, and I'm going to let Lauren talk about this, but.
Yeah, so on our campus at Purchase College, actually, mental health diagnosis is our #1 category for students coming to the office and requesting accommodations, which is a little bit different than the other SUNY campuses, but we know on every campus, mental health has been increasing. And so what they're saying is, I have a mental health diagnosis, I'm experiencing this, and because of that, I'm experiencing some type of barrier on campus. So that could be in the academic setting in my courses with note taking or requesting books in audio format. It could be in the testing setting. And sometimes due to an exacerbation of symptoms, possibly we might be doing more consultation with faculty about some of the policies in classes. So really looking at maybe attendance, or if someone has an exacerbation of symptoms and maybe had to go to the hospital because of a medication change or whatnot, consulting with faculty about that related to possibly a due date or whatnot. And so we know that 70% of students with mental health diagnoses or that rise to the disabling condition do not come to the office for accommodations. And so there's a variety of reasons for that. They possibly do not think they were sick enough to get accommodations, did not know that they could get accommodations. So what is interesting about that is oftentimes they might not know what accommodations are or that an office like that exists because they didn't have any type of support possibly in the high school setting. So that's why I think it's really important for our office to be closely connected to the counseling center, so that they can make referrals as well. Like I said, did not know what accommodations are or are afraid to talk to professors about the need possibly for accommodations, so then faculty could refer them to our office as well.
I just want to say on a personal note that this rings true for me in my professional life as someone with mental health challenges. Like it can be hard to focus or like just even have the energy sometimes to come to work. And like I never got accommodations in college. I didn't consider myself disabled. So I like feel like I'm this slide. So it's just like, it's so strange now working in this field and being like, oh my gosh, like, I just wonder, if I like Lauren said, I didn't know what accommodations would be appropriate for, someone with depression or anxiety, or whether faculty would be understanding. And because people, it really affects people differently. And some people don't feel the need, or it doesn't rise to the level of where they feel like they can't do it. Or like if I start medication, like how's that going to affect me for the next 2 weeks? Or if I get off it, how's that going to affect? I mean, it's just, so I think it's affecting our students, it's affecting your colleagues as well. So I think it's all really relevant. I think we'll just open it up for right now, before getting into some of the more, here's what you can do to improve your course. Like, do you have any questions or thoughts on what we just shared? I don't see anything, and that's totally fine. If you're still digesting it, we can move on. And I'm just going to skip this slide because we need to get to the other ones, but this is a really great resource from the United Kingdom's government on designing for specific users on the autism spectrum, screen reader users, deaf or hard of hearing individuals, dyslexia. There really is no one size fits all. But what I have done is I took a look at all those posters and extracted which recommendations benefited the most people across all disability types. And these are things many of you may already be familiar with, writing in plain language, keeping content short and simple, making the information clear, basically being as organized as possible so that it's easy to find things in your learning management system or in different folders and things like that, being as descriptive as possible, using good color contrast, like all of these tips help students across, visual impairments to anxiety to, students with cognitive disabilities. And these considerations can really guide you as you develop your courses and digital content. And it's aligned with SUNY's EIT accessibility policy. Like a lot of these things are inclusive pedagogy practices, and some of them are, they are embedded within the accessibility technical standards that exist, which we have incorporated into the accessibility policy at SUNY. So this might already be very familiar to you. And then in terms of delivering courses, I created this slide based off of the Do It network back during COVID, like at the beginning of COVID, when we were trying to rapidly support faculty with moving online. And so a lot of these considerations are really good for both synchronous and asynchronous online delivery, but they can also be really great for in-person teaching as well, like speaking key content that is presented visually. Like oftentimes, if you're drawing a formula on the board, like describing what you're doing, it can be helpful, I think, for those that learn orally or cannot see what you're doing on the chalkboard or whiteboard or whatever you're using. Just letting people know so that they know, like, that you'll field questions during or after your lecture, and what the most appropriate way to ask question is, or providing your notes in advance, identifying a note taker. These are all things that will benefit all students, but particularly students with disabilities. I don't know, Lauren, if you wanted to add any more to that, or I saw some activity in the chat, but I couldn't.
Oh, I added the links.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So these are my slides, and when we were talking about, examples of ways to support students, I've really been focusing on speaking a little bit about executive functioning. It's a very complex, thing to talk about, but I think it's really important for us to consider. So executive functioning, it's often defined as the cognitive processes that regulate our ability to sustain self-direction behavior towards a goal. So we all have executive function, strengths and possibly weaknesses. And so all of us from time to time experience difficulty with executive functioning. So old learners in new contexts might have difficulty developing plans to navigate through a learning experience. But the really important part of executive functioning is that the skills may also be compromised as the result of a learner being fatigued or stressed. And also many of our students with disabilities they have disabilities, and their executive functioning is impacted because of their disability. So oftentimes when we're working with students on the spectrum, or those with ADHD, those who have traumatic brain injuries or dyslexia, oftentimes they will report that executive functioning, these types of skills, are difficult for them in the academic setting. And so I don't want to go over them super in depth, but when you look at the different, executive functioning areas, you can start to think about how that will impact individuals, in the classroom, as well as even in our jobs. So one area is called activation. And so this is the ability to organize tasks and materials, estimating time to complete tasks, and really being good at prioritizing what do I need to get done now, what can wait till later. And this is kind of where procrastination falls under, even when you're into the task or subject. So sometimes our students will report, I have a really hard time focusing. And so what they're experiencing are difficulty sustaining focus, so sticking with that reading assignment, and also shifting focus to other tasks when needed. And then effort. So are they able to complete long-term assignments? Maybe they have more difficulty with that, but short-term assignments, so like if you break down a long assignment into smaller chunks, that might be easier for them. Also, possibly their processing speed might be a bit slower, so it takes them longer to complete things related to their classes. And then on the next slide is emotions. So sometimes individuals might have difficulty managing their frustration or modulating their emotions, especially maybe when they get feedback that might not be positive. Memory, so utilizing your working memory and accessing recall, or difficulty remembering where someone may have put something, what someone just said to them, or what they were about to say, as well as action. So maybe difficulty in regulating a pace for a task. But what I think is super interesting that no one talks about often is that these, your executive functioning skills, they're in the last part of your brain to mature, which generally matures in about our mid-20s. So if we're working with typical college-age students, we're all working with students who their executive functioning skills are not fully developed. So somewhere there are possibly, weaknesses. And so I think there are many ways, especially with our learning management system, that we can, provide more organization and more structure. And also when we, look at more about universal design for learning, if we can provide options or choices, to help with their executive functioning skills. And when you think about it, also the things that we're asking students to do in classes, such as reading or writing and note-taking, they require a lot of executive functioning to do successfully.
Yeah, Lauren, I skipped ahead to this slide because it sounded like that's what you were talking about is building executive function supports into the course development. And I also wanted to just, shout out to someone in the chat that it's not only students. I find that that I have trouble as well. We were going to ask everyone, if I can go back. Okay, I can't even go back. How has the pandemic affected your executive function? It's clearly not just affecting our students.
Right. I mean, I was going to say that, I actually took this class about executive functioning during the pandemic from Landmark College, but what I found was interesting is like when I'm at work, some of these tasks were so automatic. So I would come in and I can't even think of it. But when I had to switch from in-person to remote, the same task I would do so easily at work became so frustrating for me at home and so draining because of like the taxing it would take on my executive functioning, and also my memory overall, like my working memory, like it discussed and whatnot, was just also so impacted. I felt like all I did was sit in the same room. I had no change to any like stimuli around me to support my memory. And yeah, so I just think executive functioning overall is, we can't go deep into it today, but it would be something, if you could incorporate strategies into your classes, it would support all learners.
So I know we have a little time left, and we haven't received any questions. I hope you feel comfortable unmuting or writing in the chat. I know we're all kind of bonding here on how our mental health and executive functioning was affected, whether it affected, some people thrived from working from home and some people wanted the structure in the office. And that's exactly how our students are as well. some students are doing really well in this environment and others really need to be in person. So these are some of the things that, Lauren's campus learned from COVID-19. Why don't you share, Lauren, what you guys found in your audit?
Yeah, sure. So actually, Rebecca Oling in the library, they had done an audit prior to COVID for our online summer classes, but we since then have updated this slide. So what we've learned just from, listening to students through my office, and Rebecca works closely with faculty, ways to support the students would be making goals and objectives clear in advance in the syllabi so that students have the ability to, look at the course and say, like, is this a good fit for me? Where might I experience a barrier, and like, or maybe I'm a student who knows that my strength is test taking and I signed up for your class not knowing that I'm going to have to do an oral presentation and really lengthy essays that I just know is not a great fit. So putting that information out there in advance, putting in ways for students to monitor their progress and making them aware of how they can do that. So whether it's providing checklists or self-check quizzes, giving immediate and structured feedback is super helpful. Making sure necessary resources are clarified up front. So, how to access the textbook so they can just get everything clarified and set up to be successful from the beginning. We found that it's really helpful, and I know that not every class can do this, but offering course notes or consider recording your lectures. So this might help, oftentimes when students are coming to us to request support for note taking in the classroom, this is not every student, but a lot of times what we're hearing is, I can take most of the notes, but sometimes I can't keep up, or sometimes I'm so anxious and I don't know what is important that I just need the ability to go back to listen to the sections that I didn't hear or I just want clarified. So if there's a way to record lectures or offer some type of notes, or when I was at University of Buffalo, a lot of my faculty would post PowerPoint slides, but take out chunks of the slides so that I had to still follow along and add to my slides, because if I didn't go, I couldn't get all the information. But I found that more engaging because I knew I had to pay attention and look for what was missing. Really look at your policies and process with this disability type lens. Where might barriers exist? Maybe looking at your attendance policy, or sometimes there are these policies that the class is on Zoom and you have to have your video on the entire time. And so what barriers might students have, disability related or not, to those policies? And do the policies need to exist? We have many conservatory programs at Purchase. I totally understand in some classes, attendance policies or participation, 100% completely necessary. Sometimes when I look at class syllabi on our campus, it's not clear why that policy exists based on the course structure. So looking at that, understanding that many people are in highly distractible environments. So when you can provide captioning, it's key, right? Half the time, that's how I watch Instagram stories these days. I don't turn the video on, I read the captions. And if you don't have captions, I've moved on from your content. So, because sometimes I'm on the phone at work and I'm doing that at the same time. Or consider offering, multiple assessment options when possible. And this, when I was taking my class online at Landmark during COVID, was so motivating to me, because they had our classes set up so that when you went to do an assignment or you went to do a discussion board, you would have multiple options. And to me, that was so much more motivating, because one, I might be like, but the other one I was very into, so I would just do it. And then I took another class where they didn't always give you options, and I could tell you, I struggled sometimes to get it done because I was not motivated to do it. So even just 2 options, I thought was key for me as a learner. And looking at different assessment options, when you're in person and dependent on your class. Could you do a take-home exam where students have more days to complete the work, which would eliminate the need for extra time for tests? Or possibly students could do a presentation or a video or write a paper, all to fulfill the same course objective. So really looking at it from that lens. Other ways to recognize and avert ableism, you could create small accessibility goals. When we're presenting to our campus, a lot of this is really overwhelming. We're not asking people to just, start fresh from the beginning, but really immediately maybe looking at current materials and making sure they're accessible, and then creating some longer term goals. Taking time to ensure materials are presented consistently in your LMS, working with your tools and checkers to improve accessibility of materials before sharing them, or if you haven't learned how to make your information accessible, working with your campus instructional designer or whatnot for some training. Like I said, looking at your syllabus with a disability lens, really watching ableism in your language. So I know over the past year and a half in general, sometimes when I say phrases, I think I should really Google that to figure out why is that in my language and where does that come from? Because I think that we don't always know. Believing people when they disclose disability, and not assuming that we know what someone needs.
So I know we only have 2 minutes left, and I think we got through the majority of our presentation, but these are just some additional things that we wanted to share outside of the classroom, or even outside of the direct interaction with your course. Students with disabilities would love mentorship from you, faculty with disabilities or disability studies scholars. There's really few clubs or communities that are specific or inclusive of the disabled community. Infusing disability in the curriculum, even in your examples, is really, what I think we hear from other students as well, right? Students of color and other students that want to be represented in, in the curriculum as well. So I think students with disabilities, like other groups, want the same thing. And we'll just end right here with this quote that Lauren found, which is really great, about how the world which people have constructed is made by and for non-disabled people, for those who can climb stairs, turn doorknobs and faucets, see where they are going, hear voices, commit instructions and information to memory. Educational programs reflect these values. Let's challenge this and construct a more inclusive and valuable educational environment, and your your support in doing this, and sharing this knowledge with your peers, and modeling it in the classroom and in everyday meetings, I think will go such a long way. We've added some resources, and this is our contact information if you'd like to message us privately. I know I shared the presentation in the chat, and I think Rebecca can share it with you after as well.
Definitely. I would want to just invite everybody, including our speakers, if you're willing, to join us for a conversation afterwards as well, at 11. We really appreciate Nasli and Lauren joining us and spending some time with us on our virtual campus to have this conversation. It's nice to kind of mix it up a little sometimes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's always good to meet other people across SUNY, especially similar minds. We're happy to join the discussion. I think we just need the link.
It's the same link.
Oh, okay.